This is going to be a summary of the paper by Medley et al. On Aedes albopictus, which is the invasive Asian tiger mosquito. I'm going to have a few videos here. The first one is going to be about background hypotheses and predictions, and I want to go into a lot of detail with this to help you get set up and on the right page for following what the methods and then the results of the paper are. And those will be in separate videos, so you can kind of take these in smaller bites. So first I want to talk a little bit about mosquitoes because people generally don't know that much about mosquitoes, and knowing a little bit about them will be somewhat helpful in interpreting things. Um, you may or may not know that it's only the females that feed, that get blood meals. They do that so that they can provision their eggs. And in many mosquitoes, especially Aedes albopictus, they need to take multiple blood meals per batch of eggs. So what that means is over the 3-week lifespan that female is reproductive, she will feed many times. So there's a good opportunity for picking up parasites or diseases in one host individual and then passing it on to another individual. Males only live about 1 week, and during the time that they're alive and during the time when females are not blood feeding, they are pollinators visiting flowers and things like that. So they're not all terrible, but when they deliver and vector diseases like these mosquitoes do, that they're pretty much bad. A female can have up to 5 clutches of eggs, and a clutch is a batch of eggs, and in each clutch there can be upwards of 100 eggs, so one female can have a pretty high reproductive rate. Now most people don't know that there's almost 200 species of different kinds of mosquitoes in the US. Alabama's got approximately 60, so about a third of all the mosquitoes species that are in the US we have in Alabama. There's really only a handful of them though that bite people, and they tend to be associated with people's houses and with cities and things like that. In fact, the density of mosquitoes can be upwards of 10 to 20 times higher in cities than in forested places away from where people are. So many of the mosquitoes that you need to worry about are ones that have a long evolutionary history with humans and human-like habitats. So they've sort of become adapted to live around humans and feed on humans. Many mosquitoes, though, a large majority of the mosquitoes that are out there, don't feed on humans at all. They'll feed on other animals, turtles, frogs, birds, mammals. So the ones that people have to worry about, there's really only a handful, about 4 or 5 in the state of Alabama. And most of those are non-native species. So again, many mosquitoes live in more natural habitats, and they oviposit or lay eggs in more natural habitats. But a lot of the human-associated species, like albopictus, breed in garbage and any place that wastewater, not really wastewater, but rainwater will accumulate, such as old tires, because the water that gets into tires, it's really hard to get rid of that. Bird baths, even Coke and water bottles that are sitting out in the garbage. If they get any water in them at all and that water doesn't evaporate very quickly, it will have some algal growth in it, some bacteria, and the female mosquitoes will land on the surface of that water, lay a bunch of eggs in there, and boom, all of a sudden you've got a bunch of mosquitoes. The best control practice for keeping human biting mosquitoes in check is not through spraying, but is through the treatment and removal of these breeding habitats. So if you've got garbage sitting around that with standing water in it, that's the best way to take care of them. So any sorts of these stagnant water habitats that are associated with humans are just great for these mosquitoes. They have a really fast growth cycle. They can reproduce, and then a new generation of adults can come out in as short as 2 to 3 weeks. And they can fly upwards of, it depends on the species, but the book mentions almost a kilometer away to seek new hosts and find new oviposition sites. So I want to talk a little bit about the life cycle of mosquitoes because there's a couple important concepts in the life cycle for understanding this paper. Given that it's a cycle, we can sort of start anywhere, but let's start with adults mating. So the males and the females reproduce. the female has to have typically multiple blood meals in order to provision for her eggs. Once she's fed on a host, whether it's a human or a bird or whatever, um, albopictus females lay eggs right at the water level or right on the surface of the water, typically right on the edge of a container. And these eggs, once they're laid, they are sensitive to the light conditions, so that's the photoperiod, how much light is there in a day, and also the current temperature. And they take those environmental cues into account and they either hatch, in which case they continue on with the life cycle, or they just sort of wait in a resting stage until conditions are good, and that would be the stage where the paper talks about where they are in diapause. This is cued again by light and by temperature regimes. The female lays eggs just above the water line. When more water comes in, the eggs hatch, larvae emerge, and they go through 4 larval stages. These are also known as instars. So all of these larval stages are instars. They hatch, they're very small. They get to a point where they just can't grow anymore because they've got an exoskeleton. They shed that exoskeleton, and then they feed a little bit more and grow some more, etc., until they reach the pupal stage. They pupate in the water, and then that's where they transform from this little larval mosquito, which is in the water, and it's feeding on bacteria and other things, algae in the water. Then it emerges from the water. After this pupal stage, we've got another mosquito, and that cycle continues. Let's talk about a few more specifics with this Asian tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus. It's originally native to Southeast Asia. It entered the U.S. in the mid 1980s, according to the paper. This happened in Texas, probably in some tires that had been shipped around, and that was coincident with spreading throughout most of the world in that same time period. So a mosquito that is basically everywhere now is one that wasn't pretty much anywhere except Southeast Asia until the early 80s. And since the 80s, so that past 40-ish year time span, it has spread throughout a big chunk of the world. It's a competent vector for several diseases, including yellow fever, dengue fever, chikungunya fever, and Zika virus. Um, there are other members of Aedes, this genus Aedes, that are vectors for other really bad diseases, but at least in the U.S., these are not pleasant diseases, but they're not the worst that are out there, vectored by mosquitoes. This particular mosquito does contact a lot of hosts, though, because it feeds in the daytime. A lot of mosquitoes will only feed at dawn and dusk, and primarily just at dusk or throughout the night, but this mosquito feeds when humans are active, all day from the time the sun comes up until nighttime. So this is a very problematic bitey insect. So I just want to step aside a second because there's a couple very important terms. Cline is probably the much more important term, and it's not one that most people immediately recognize. So a cline is some kind of gradient in some ecologically important environmental value, such as moisture, temperature, soil type, whatever. This is an example of a forest cline that goes up a hillside. And so the clines might be in terms of how much dead wood is available, what the plants are like, but also some environmental factors like pH and soil nutrients. So this cline is represented by the change of the environmental variable over some spatial distance. In the paper for today, of course, the major environmental cline is temperature. Then one other small term for now, ad libitum feeding means to give an animal all the food they can possibly eat. They're not going to be food limited at all. They get all the food that they want. The picture on the left here is the growth zones for, let's say, if you wanted to plant a garden or decide what kinds of plants you should grow in your garden. That reflects the temperature and the climate faced by the whole of North America. And it also has some rankings based on sort of temperature ranges. And you'll see on the right a different version of a map of the distribution of Aedes albopictus up to 2016, which is not terribly long ago. You can see that in these spaces here, all the yellow areas are places where it has grown, where it has been seen at least 1 year. And so it occurs much throughout the southeast. Now it's getting into the Midwest and even the upper Midwest and New England states. It was first introduced in California in the 70s, but because of monitoring and control efforts, and maybe because the habitat wasn't appropriate, the mosquitoes died out. But it has now become established after multiple successful invasions, and so now it's established in Southern California. So you can see that the current distribution reflects uh, relatively semi-tropical or warm temperate zones, but it is also spreading into what would be considered cooler and cooler growth zones for both plants and animals um, in the sort of central U.S. They talk a little bit about context. This is more of applied, obviously applied paper than many of the other ones that we've looked at throughout the semester. And on page 2, they mention that they wanted to investigate the rapid adaptation in the U.S. range for this particular species because it is, as they say, a competent vector, and I mentioned that earlier. And competent means that it can transmit several diseases. It amplifies the disease and then spreads it from one host to another. Could be multiple individuals of the same host species or potentially even across species. And they early on put this paper in context of the desire to potentially help managing the spread of this very important disease vector. They don't come out very clearly and say what their hypotheses are. Unfortunately, we haven't had any good examples recently of papers that do come out clearly and state what their hypotheses are. But I think in this paper it's maybe a little easier than some of the papers that we've seen recently. So this is from the bottom of page 2 going into the top of page 3. And this is a little bit of background kind of setting up their questions and hypotheses. So in this part of the paragraph, they talk about there are predictions of where it should occur, but look, it's spread farther than what we think it should do. So why is it that it is outside of areas that we think it should be in? Other papers have found a decline in diapause that matches the environmental decline, and they propose that maybe the one answer to this question is that maybe the populations have actually evolved. They've become adapted to these northern temperature regimes. And then all papers should, they don't always, but they should have an indication of the gap in knowledge that their paper will address. And here they do state the gap, which is that adaptation at the northern range edge remains unknown and largely unstudied, but should be most strong where overwinter survival of diapause eggs is critical to fitness and potential expansion of northern populations. So what they're going to be looking for is the selective factors and sort of the responses to those selective factors for this species of mosquito. This is from high up on page 3, this paragraph, and I highlighted 3 different sections where I think they get a little bit more specific with what's going on with the hypothesis of the paper. So at the start of this paragraph, we evaluated local adaptation. This states what they did. And the local adaptation part, which we'll talk about in a bit, is sort of the broad hypothesis. They think that these populations have become adapted to specific locales and the environmental regimes in these specific locales. That's what local adaptation means. And again, I'll talk about this more in a little bit. More specifically is the second highlighted part. They wanted to evaluate whether this species is broadly adapted to winter or if northern populations are adapted to northern winters. So they get a little bit more specific here. The first part of that sentence is their null hypothesis, or sort of their reference hypothesis. One hypothesis, one possibility, is that these mosquitoes, wherever they happen to be from, is they're already adapted to cold environments. So you could take somebody from Georgia and transplant them all the way up into Pennsylvania, and they could do great. If that's the case, then we really got to worry, because all the insects, all the mosquitoes, individuals of Aedes albopictus throughout the U.S. have the ability to adapt, or are already adapted to cooler temperatures. The alternative hypothesis, and the one that they favor more, is that northern populations, these edge populations, are the ones that are actually locally adapted. Evolution has occurred and they are now locally adapted to those cooler environments, but the southern populations are not adapted to cold environments. So they've got two possible hypotheses, and what they're going to do in their study is try to discriminate amongst these. They've developed a test that will allow them to say whether there is more support for one of these hypotheses than another. And what they think is going to happen is that this is the expected part at the bottom here. They expected range edge genotypes to be uniquely suited to northern winters compared to southern genotypes. They think that's going to happen because their rationale is that there should be some kinds of costs to diapause in the south. Otherwise, why wouldn't the ones in the south also be adapted to northern climates? So there's some cost of having diapause if you live in the south, but you're a more northern population. Exhibiting diapause when you really shouldn't, that would be a costly thing, because otherwise your genotype could be passed along a lot faster if you didn't go into diapause. You could have more generations per year. So they think that there is actually a cost to expressing diapause. So that's why they would suspect that it's not everybody that's adapted to cold temperatures, only the ones where it benefits them, and the benefits of being adapted to cold temperatures outweigh the costs.